Okay, just one more time, like I said, just to the camera.
Oh, the same thing?
Yeah, same thing.
Oh, I thought that was like the warm-up. Okay, so I'm Dr. Dan O'Keefe, and I work as an extension educator with MSU and Michigan Sea Grant. So my job is to bring science-based information to people who need it, whether that's decision makers who are trying to weigh pros and cons of different environmental decisions, or to business people who make a living on the water, like fishing guides and charter boat captains.
Beautiful. Awesome. So how long have you been studying, and how many years of expertise do you have about the Grand River?
Well, I've really been on the Grand River for the last 25 years off and on, kayaking, fishing, and doing research projects in the watershed. I've really had some of my most enlightening experiences while out just enjoying the river. So I have done some studies, but really that time on the water, just observing through spending time kayaking or fishing is very valuable too.
Awesome. How significant would you say is the Grand River to the ecology of the Great Lakes region, Ottawa County, and West Michigan?
So the Grand River is the largest river in Michigan, the longest by measurement of 250 plus miles long of main stem river plus thousands of miles of tributary streams. And when we talk about a river, we're really talking about a connected ecosystem that involves all those tributary streams and the floodplains as well. A lot of people don't think about how important the floodplains to the side of the river are, but there are a lot of lakes that are connected in there. There are a lot of wetland areas that provide nursery and spawning habitat for fish and lots of habitat for wildlife. So as such, being such a big watershed, the Grand River is inherently important, and it's one of the major contributors of water to Lake Michigan, as well as the things that come along with the water, like nitrogen and other things that we might not necessarily want in the water. But it also provides fertility. It provides a lot of nutrients to Lake Michigan, and regionally, it's a very important resource for people. Grand Rapids was ranked number 6 in the list of best places to live for people who like fishing by Field and Stream magazine. So it's a great place to fish for anyone in the region who wants to get out and go kayaking, fishing, or just walking along the river to enjoy nature. The Grand is a very important recreational resource, and it also provides habitat for a lot of different fish and wildlife.
Awesome. Beautiful. Thank you. So now just are you able to describe some parts of the ecology of the Grand River? Like what species does the Grand River support? What kind of fish breed in the Grand River?
Like unique ones that are...
Whoa, yeah, there's a long list. So I put together, as part of my job here with Sea Grant, a list of the fish in the Grand River, and there are more than 100 fish just in this lower section of the Grand River here. And the connections are really important. So some of those fish move in to the Grand River to spawn from Lake Michigan. Other fish move out of the Grand River and into tributary streams to spawn, or perhaps into those floodplain lakes where they need to lay their eggs. There are all these different species. There are fish like pike that use the floodplain lakes to spawn. There are fish like salmon and steelhead, which enter the river from Lake Michigan to find spawning grounds. And then there are fish that live their whole life in the river but move around from one area to another, like the threatened river red horse. We also have some really interesting large fish like the threatened lake sturgeon. Lake sturgeon are a state threatened species, and they move into the Grand River from Lake Michigan to spawn in spring. So occasionally you'll see one breach. These fish are 5 to 6 feet long. They're very rare, but they are out there, and they do spawn successfully in the Grand River. Another really neat fish that we have out here is the muskie. The Great Lakes muskie is a spotted fish that grows to about 4.5 feet long, and they call it the fish of 10,000 casts because it's very hard to catch. But they do live out here in the Grand, and there's a chance just paddling along, fishing for bass, that you could tie into the fish of a lifetime if you hook into a Great Lakes muskie. And those fish have been stocked now for the last several years by the DNR, trying to restore their populations.
Wow, I didn't realize there's so many kinds of fish. What other kinds of wildlife rely on the Grand River?
So we have a tremendous number of species that use some part of the Grand River watershed. And again, it's all connected. So There are over 200 species of birds in the watershed, about 50 different species of mammals, and 43 different species of herps. We call them herps. They're both amphibians and reptiles. So there's a lot of different wildlife diversity. There's certain species like mink. You'll see mink in the islands on the Grand River quite often that really depend on the river, and other species that rely more on the different kinds of habitat we have with the different terrestrial vegetation. There are over 50 species of greatest conservation need, ranging from plants and frogs to mussels that really depend on high quality water in the river. And we have some state threatened mussel species right here in this stretch of the Grand River. Upstream, we even have federally endangered snuffbox mussel.
Wow, awesome. What do you think would be the most important thing for people to know about, or for people in West Michigan to know about the Grand River?
Well, I think there are a couple important things to know about the Grand River. First is it's a great asset for recreation and for providing the wildlife and fish habitat that it does. Sometimes people have this conception that the Grand River is dirty, polluted, and it certainly has had its problems, but a lot of those problems have really gotten a lot better in recent years. We don't have as many problems with sewage spills anymore. We also have much cleaner water by many measures because of the Clean Water Act and the limits on point source pollution. They look at the water and they say, well, it's muddy, it's got to be dirty. A certain amount of that turbidity, that muddiness, is natural for a large river. Now, we also have some excess sediment getting into the watershed from non-point source pollution as well, but the river is probably better off than most people think. And it's also important to note that the connections are really important. The river is not just the river itself that you see flowing in the channel. It's also the floodplains to either side of the river that naturally need to flood every year. We call the floodplains the kidneys of the river. They're really important in helping filter out some of that extra sediment and nutrients. And in doing so, they provide fantastic habitat for a lot of rare species of fish and animals. So the river is really this connected system that includes the little tributaries, the little streams, the floodplain lakes, and the river itself, and even Lake Michigan. As I mentioned, there's a lot of fish that use Lake Michigan for part of their life cycle.
For waterway projects.
So the Grand River Waterway project is a plan to dredge 50 acres of shallow habitat out of 22.5 miles of the Grand River between Bass River State Recreation Area near Eastmanville and Grand Rapids. And this project would remove some shallow habitat, including some very important shallow gravel riffles that are used for spawning by many fish, and also as feeding habitat for some very well-known sport fish like smallmouth bass, walleye, and even muskie, a really rare, high-quality sport fish. Some of the specific areas that would be affected also provide habitat for state-threatened mussels like the purple wartyback and black sandshell, some fun names there. And also, one of the riffles that would be affected directly is one of the best spawning habitats for the state-threatened river red horse, which is a species of fish that grows to over 30 inches long and has a bright red tail. Not many people see these fish, but they're important to the ecology of the river, and they feed on our native mussels, which is one of the reasons that they're so rare. Projects that create more silt and disturbance in the river destroy the mussels and therefore impact fish like the river red horse that depend on mussels. And that's not all. We also have threatened fish like the lake sturgeon that use the river as well.
Awesome. That's great. So how would things like these projects affect like fisheries downstream and communities like Grand Haven, like the quality of the water in our riverbeds?
So the Grand River Waterway is a project that involves dredging, but it's different than the harbor dredging projects that we tend to think about in West Michigan. Often we dredge out the mouths of rivers to make sure that boats can get back and forth from harbors in river mouth lakes and into Lake Michigan. But this kind of dredging project is really a river channelization project. They're talking about making a channel through 22.5 miles of river. And when you do that, you disturb the bottom of the river to such an extent that you can create ongoing problems with additional erosion that can last for decades. So we're not just talking about the impact of physically removing that sediment. There is an impact to that, but we're really concerned about the ongoing problems with erosion that would lead to much more sediment in the water, and that sediment's going to go somewhere. It's going to go downstream and potentially create the need for additional dredging down at the mouth of the river. We also have a lot of different things that might be found in the sediments of the river. We don't know exactly about toxins yet, but when you have a lot of sediment in the river, a lot of silt, you certainly have a lot of nutrients, things like phosphorus, that stimulate the growth of algae. They don't stimulate the growth of algae when they're buried in the river, but after they get stirred up and washed downstream, you might see some additional problems with water quality in Lake Michigan. And in Grand Haven, downstream from here, we're very conscious about the water quality at our beaches, and we're very conscious of the fact that that area of the river has to be dredged regularly to provide for navigational traffic already, and this could really exacerbate those problems.
One second before we keep time.
So what kind of impact do you think would happen downstream and fisheries and quality of water in the riverbed?
We're doing the other question.
Oh, the
Same
other one.
question.
That was the same.
That was the same
Oh, it
question.
was?
Downstream.
Okay, never mind.
So,
I can repeat it. sorry.
okay, yeah, go ahead.
What do you believe the impact would be on fisheries downstream, specifically in Grand Haven, and also in quality of water and in the riverbed?
So when we talk about dredging, in West Michigan, a lot of times we think about dredging out harbors. And that's an important thing for communities that are on Lake Michigan, because large boats can't really dock on Lake Michigan proper. They have to go into rivermouth areas where marinas and safe harbors are that are protected from the wind. So when we talk about dredging, we think sometimes of these harbor dredging projects, but this Grand River Waterway project is a very different kind of project. It is a river channelization project that would create a continuous 22.5 mile channel in the river proper. And rivers don't function the same way in upstream areas like this. They move a lot of sediment. There's a lot of erosion going on. So when you disturb the bottom of the river, you can potentially lead to additional erosion that continues for decades. It's not just a matter of removing the sediment as a one-time deal. Instead, you're destabilizing the bottom of the river, which can lead to erosion of both the shore and the bed of the river at a much higher rate. Where does all that go? Well, when you have all this sand and sediment eroded, it has to fall out of suspension at some point, and that tends to be in a downriver area like Grand Haven. So communities downstream are very concerned about all of this sediment coming downstream. We already know that we have to dredge every few years to keep the Grand Haven harbor open. This could potentially lead to more dredging costs downstream, but we also have to worry about what's in the sediment that's coming down the river. We don't know for sure about potential toxins that could be locked up in the bottom of the river now, but we do know that we tend to have a lot of nutrients in any sediment that comes downstream. And nutrients can be a problem too, because nutrients stimulate the growth of algae and tend to lead to lower water quality, especially in areas like the lower Grand River that already have excess nutrients in them. So in Grand Haven, we're really concerned about the health of beaches, and we've had issues with beach closures in the past, and beach muck could potentially be another issue if we have too many nutrients coming downstream. Another thing to mention about this project is the bottom of the Grand River is mostly sand through Ottawa County, and a lot of the area that would be impacted by dredging is sand bottomed. However, this river was dredged back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the way they did things was they created training walls. They have 25 miles of walls built in the river, and what they did was they built these training walls, and then they dredged material from the middle of the channel and they put it on the other side of the training wall. So they artificially made the river narrower and deeper. Now, if this potential project was to go through with the Grand River Waterway, it would break through portions of those training walls and leave all that sediment that was put there back in the early 1900s to potentially erode right back into the main channel of the river.
Wow.
Beautiful. That was great.
And then one last question. Would these changes be reversible in the future? Like, how long of a time period are we looking at?
So it can be really difficult to predict exactly how dredging will impact a river's ecology and the morphology of the river itself. The way that the balance of erosion and sediment plays out is almost impossible to precisely predict. But what we know from studying similar systems that have been impacted all over the world is that it's definitely a bad thing for the health of the river and for the animals in the river. So one of the worst things about this is that it can take decades to really return to some kind of normalcy. In the Grand River, we've had impacts of dredging going back more than 100 years, and the river is still impaired by some of those past dredging efforts. A study of invertebrates done by the MDEQ in 2009 found that we really haven't recovered our natural biota, the natural invertebrates that we would expect in this river, and part of that is due to the fact that we still have the impacts of this past dredging. So we can expect, we can't give a precise year when things might recover if dredging ever stops, but we can say that usually it takes communities decades to recover from the effects of dredging. Several studies with fish have found that rivers really don't recover for 30, 40, 50 years after dredging. And the amazing thing is that the ongoing impacts of channelization tend to be worse even than short-term impacts that we experience from terrible things like chemical spills.
I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to say, but that we covered everything.
Yeah,
I think that was
that covered
amazing.
our basis, but if you've got any more.
Yeah, just let us know.
I think that's pretty good. I tried to work a lot in there.
That was awesome,
Awesome.
for sure.
This is amazing. This is.
I might have got too passionate at the end.